Right, so I am going to do two things, as Joe's told you this morning. One, I'm going to update the long-running IPA effectiveness study that looks specifically at the contribution that news brands makes to effectiveness. Those of you who heard me speak 2 years ago when we last updated this will know that the issue of trust is a big factor in the story of effectiveness that surrounds news brands. And since this is a trust event, I'm going to deep dive into the whole issue of trust. Now, I know there's a certain amount of skepticism out there. Trust has had a bit of a bad press in recent years. And I understand that. You know, I might have been one of those skeptics a few years back, but it all changed really 2 years ago when I last looked at the IPA data on news brands. And the only way I could explain what I was seeing was through the explosion of trust effects and the issue of trust. So I did a lot of digging then, which I'm going to update now, which opened my eyes to the whole issue of trust. And so if there are any of you who are skeptical, I hope to convince you that actually trust shouldn't be written off as a kind of, I don't know, a kind of piece of wokery, which I think some people think it is. It is not. It's clearly a very real issue. Right, so let's get into it. Before I get into the raw data, the effectiveness data and the trust data, there are two areas of context that I need to set up. This is obviously the latest 2-year period, the 2022 awards data, coming on the back of a 10-plus year study that we've been doing with news brands. It's got stronger and stronger as time goes by. But clearly the last 2 years have been somewhat unusual, as we all know. So I will take a look at how COVID particularly has kind of affected the latest data, because that's a piece of context we need to view the results in. This has not been a vintage year for effectiveness for anyone. And I thought, this is absolutely hot off the press. Nobody has seen this before. I thought you might like to see my doom and gloom timeline that I've become increasingly associated with. So this is the chart that everyone hates me presenting because it just shows how awful things have been. This is the timeline that relates effectiveness to the short-termism that we know has been a factor in marketing really since the onset of the performance marketing revolution. So there are 4 phases now to my timeline. There's phase 1, the early part of the millennium, when short-termism was under control. Small amounts of budget, media reflected a commitment to long-term brand building. And we had all the benefits of new digital media plus marketing science helping us be smarter. And we saw an amazing rising trend of effectiveness in this data. Then the global financial crisis plus performance marketing started an obsession with short-termism, the disinvestment in brand, the overinvestment in performance marketing, and we basically threw it all away. And then in 2020, I was cocky enough to say, hey, maybe we've turned the corner. Blue chip marketers are finally getting the picture. And we saw a number of examples around the world of marketers, Airbnbs of this world, who suddenly realized that actually brand was important. So in 2020, we saw for the first time a reversal of that trend, recommitment to long-term brand building, a reduction in the percentage of budget that, for instance, went on social for the very first time in this run of data. And cocky fools like me said, yeah, maybe we've turned the corner on this. But then, of course, COVID came along and you know what happened. Now, these are 6-year aggregated figures, so this smooths out the effect of COVID, but you can see a total reverse of the trend. Rise of short-termism, as everyone does when they fear recession. We knew it was going to happen. It happened big time. And it's a total mirror image, this chart. I could invent this data. When short-termism rises, effectiveness falls. I could almost predict it if I had any artificial intelligence, which I don't. So let's just look, and I can't dig into 1 year's data because we're looking here at only the UK data in the sample, and we are looking at users throughout this study. We're looking at users of news brands versus non-users. And the problem we have always is there aren't that many non-users. It's about a third of the sample, as you'll see. So we can't generally dig into just the 2022 data because there just isn't enough data. So, but this is one of the rare cases when I will forgive myself for being a bit footloose with the data and actually look at really what happened in 2022. So the issue of brand trust and brand quality, as you will see, are very important to my story of news brands. So I'll show you, these are objectives. These are the inputs to campaigns and strategic thinking that took place in 22 compared to 20. So you can see interest in trust abated. Didn't go away entirely, but people had other objectives during that time. The issue of brand quality, the esteem, the respect people have for our brands absolutely fell away. It was replaced with an obsession with defensive posture, defensive strategies, and we know that they don't drive effectiveness. Les and I demonstrated that in our very first publication 20 years ago almost. And there was a walking away from the issue of driving profit, which is the single most important objective we know of them all. And as you can see at the bottom, short-termism exploded from about 12% of case studies to about a third, all of which is totally predictable. But I'm not going to excuse it, because actually for many of these case studies, many of these brands in many sectors, COVID didn't represent a downturn. It was the fear of downturn that actually drove this, wildly overplayed. Outcomes, again, very predictable. We saw a dramatic decline in the achieved effects on trust and brand quality, which you kind of know, I'm arguing, are very important to long-term business effects. So those fell away. Brand effects in general, because people were pulling out of brand building, just trying to keep their brands going because they all panicked. Brand effects fell off a cliff. That's a terrible, terrible reversal of trend. Profit, very large profit effects, which is again one of the most important metrics we have here, fell away very, very sharply. And business effects, that is the worst single shift from one period to the next in the entire data bank. Worse even than 2008. So, but this was a wild overreaction. I mean, we know COVID was scary, but this was a wild overreaction. Anyway, the long and short of all of that is that we have to view the results we're going to get through the filter of COVID. It was not a vintage period for effectiveness. You don't need me to tell you that. And, you know, shift to defensive objectives, not good news. Short-termism, terrible news. Loss of business effectiveness, worse even than 08. And all the rest of it. But most worrying to me here is that there was this particular shift away from trust and other proven growth drivers like quality. And we'll come back and talk about that later. So let's start, one more piece of context I should just say, which is we have to also remember, for reasons that will become clear as we go through, that there have been big changes over the 10 plus years of this study in terms of how marketers use news brands. Happily, they still use it very strongly, but their patterns of usage between digital and print have changed radically. And of course, that's very important to my story. So let's just quickly review that. So I've just divided it's kind of 12 years of data we've kind of got here. If you look at the case study length, we divide it into 3 periods. That is how the print only, advertisers that chose the print only platform, that has fallen away to 0. Kind of inevitably, though I'm going to be arguing very strongly that print is a very important contributor to the overall effectiveness, but we live in a digital obsessed world, so I'm not surprised to see that. I don't think it's smart, but anyway, I'm not surprised to see it. Largely replaced, of course, by the people who think, well, news brands is really all about digital, isn't it? And that's, I think, missing the point about the way news brands work, and particularly the way the trust effect works. Is a halo that comes from the synergies between print, the signalling that print brings to advertisers. This is a really important area. Print is a very public, very trusted, very open environment, and the signalling effects halo onto digital. So when you choose digital only, as you're going to see, you miss out on an awful lot of the benefits of news brands. And what I'm particularly disappointed in, having rabbited on about how best practice is to use digital and print platforms. Everyone, of course, ignores me. It's the story of my life. So you see the falling away of the multi-platform usage, which is a shame, because as you're going to see, that is the way to get the most out of news brands. If you're going to invest in news brands, don't ignore print. And we know from reach and readership data that more than half of the reach of news brands comes from readers who either are exposed to both platforms or just print. So walking away from print really doesn't make any sense, not even now in these white hot digital days. So let's move on. Let's deep dive into some of the effectiveness data, the case for news brands before we go into trust. And I would just say we do a lot of work each time, and I won't bore you with all the details, to ensure that we are comparing like with like, that when we compare advertisers that used news brands with advertisers that did not use news brands, that we are comparing a comparable sample of cases, that this is a level playing field. We do this every year. I'm not going to give you the detail. There are some minor differences. There are some sector differences between the two, but they work in both ways. They pull in both directions. So there's nothing there that really leads me to say either news brands users or non-users have any advantage. The most important but the most important metric, of course, is budget, which we measure as extra share of voice, difference between share of voice and share of market. And that is virtually identical between these two groups. In fact, it is slightly lower for users of news brands than non-users. Not so much lower that we need worry about it. So this is a level playing field, and we can be reasonably confident that when we compare the effectiveness of news brand users with non-news brand users, that the only really important difference is this critical media choice, because everything else is pretty damn similar. So let's just look at the top level here. So this is over the entire period of the study, 10 plus years of data. Let's look at the three important metrics that I tend to focus on: market share growth, pricing power, which is the margin driver, and as you're going to see throughout this data, it's a really important part of the story, and those two conflate to drive profit growth, which of course is the thing that our clients are all after. So if you look at the straight comparison, 12 years of data, 250 odd case studies here, 2/3 of which by and large use news brands and by and large 1/3 of which did not. You can see big uplifts to market share growth amongst those who use news brands, big and solid and not eroding, it's strengthening as you're going to see over time. Pricing power increase, it remains true as it has done throughout this study, 10 plus years, that not a single campaign that failed to use news brands had anything big to report on pricing power, not one of them. That remains true to this day, whereas quite a healthy level of case studies reported large pricing effects who did. Now this is a metric that never has big numbers because not every marketer measures this. So 9% is quite a good score for this particular metric. If you conflate those two and look at profit again, you see what we've always seen here: big, healthy uplifts to profit growth amongst those case studies who use news brands. And we'll be looking, as I go through this data, to spare endless bars, we'll be looking at uplifts later on. So the uplift is the difference between the two bars expressed as a percentage of the non-users. So you're going to see more and more uplifts as we go through, because otherwise you get bamboozled by the data. Let's look at some time trend data, because again, the really important finding that cropped up first time last 2 years ago of this study is that there is a real inflection point in the data. There is a point at which news brands, which had always been an effective medium, suddenly became a super effective medium. And that I first noticed last time round 2 years ago, and it is in the explanation of that sudden inflection point that the whole trust story emerged. So let's just have a look, and we'll compare the first half of the period with the second half, because that is when the inflection point occurred, and so I get the sharpest difference between the two. So it tells a stronger story. So this is the picture for non-news brands users. As you already know from my doom and gloom opening chart, this was a period generally of declining effectiveness in marketing in general, and certainly in UK marketing. So amongst non-advertising news brands, over that period we saw a decline in the broad effectiveness metric, which is what this is, a basket of 6 business metrics, everything from sales growth to profit growth. So it's my broad general effectiveness metric on the way down for these. But for news brands advertisers, I'm happy to say it was stable, minute increase. So it was bucking the trend. Now I told you we were going to see some uplifts, so those are the uplifts. So compared to non-users, news brand users saw an uplift rise from 32% to just over 50%. So the relativity is strengthening all the time. And you have to always view IPA data in this context, that the time trends have generally been negative. So even holding your own is a very positive performance. And news brand users have generally done that spectacularly well, or, as we'll see in some metrics, increased effectiveness. So if we look at some of the individual metrics, this is market share performance for non-users, really turning down over that period of time, doing very badly. And again, this is driven, of course, largely by short-termism, but other factors as well. So the market in general was doing very badly. News brands users were doing very nicely. Not a stellar performance, but very strongly bucking the trend. That's the uplifts, 31 up to 88. Sensational performance, really. So increasingly what you see is if you want to buck the effectiveness trend, as we'll see, particularly that applies to a lot of digital media choices we might make. The way to do that is to counterbalance by investment in news brands, and we'll see this time and time again. It's a good broadener out of the effectiveness of campaigns. This is profit. Ooh, ouch, not very nice for non-news brand users. Ooh, very nice for news brand users. Complete reversal of the trend. Again, particularly because you've got the multipliers at work when you look at that. Uplifts 24 up to 88. So again, a really strong performance that I can't explain in any other way. And you know what my explanation is, because we're all about trust, so we're going to be seeing that as the real smoking gun here in why this performance seems to have become so much stronger. It was great before, it's even greater now. Let's look now at how those effects build as we lean into news brands and how we make more use of platforms. In the past, I've looked at 0 versus 1 versus 2, but of course, in the recent time period, as you've seen, single platform usage of news brands essentially means digital. So let's cut to the chase and just look at what happens when you use just digital news brands with what happens when you also use print. And this is why I keep banging on about the best way to get value out of news brands is to use both. You'll see this kind of pattern, with a few exceptions, time and time again in this data. Using digital only is good, but using digital and print is very good. It's even better because you've got these multiplier effects. The two work together, and also what I've already mentioned, the signaling value of being in print. And we know that a lot of news brands audience use both themselves. I have to say I'm a digital only reader, but I am really not the majority. Most people get print as well. Those are the uplifts, 33 to 61. It is, we get twice as much out essentially when we use print as well as digital than if we just use digital. So do it. Don't be over trendy about this. Good old-fashioned print. And Andy and Ian are going to explain to you, I'm sure, why this might be the case. I have a few theories myself, but anyway. Let's look at some individual metrics. So this is one of the ones that is interesting, and I share this with you because I think it teaches us the importance of not being driven by one metric. If you just look at volume growth, which I'm sure many of your clients do, you will think, well, digital is the real driver. And we know digital has advantages in terms of driving volume response. You've got all of the kind of click-through, easy direction, immediate physical availability, if you like, in some sectors that you can get from that. So if we're brutally honest, it is clearly digital news brands that are doing the heavy lifting when it comes to driving the volume response. Clearly also print does its part in that because it builds over and above anything that non-news brands users get, but the real heavy lifting is being done by the digital platform for all the usual reasons in the digital world. But if you're only driven by that, you miss the important other side to the story, which is about the respect, esteem, and therefore the pricing power that brands have, which is a brand-driven, brand strength-driven quality that we build. And that comes most powerfully through print, the print side of the story. So you really need two platforms to be driving pricing effects. And so when you conflate those two, of course, what you see is that if you really want to do the best you can in a profit sense for your client, which is what we're all about, you really should be investing in both platforms again. So that's why I bang on about it. Don't be only obsessed by volume response. It's margin and profit that we're really here to do for our clients. Let's just look at some of the time trends in all of that. And again, it's kind of interesting here. So market share. So here we're going to my view of what best practice is. We're looking at those multi-platform users because otherwise I'd be chucking crazy amounts of data at you. So this is what I recommend everyone should be doing. This is the strengthening advantages that best practice users of news brands that are using print and digital have got out of the medium over time. There used to be a nice uplift, so this is uplift versus non-users. It has doubled over pre and post that inflection point. Up to the 2016 kind of period, it was about a 42% uplift. Since then, it has more or less doubled. See, something really, really powerful happened about that time, which I would characterize as the beginning of the fake news era. We had Brexit, we had Trump, we had Cambridge Analytica, we had all sorts of shit, and I use that word very, very deliberately, went on in that period. And I think, for all sorts of reasons that I'm sure Andy and Ian will talk about, it made a quantum difference to how some advertising environments seemed to work, particularly affected news brands. Profit, whoa, extraordinary difference. It's quadrupled. It's become a real profit driver, even more so than it used to be. And if we look at all business metrics, there's a lot of ones in there that are less important, but for the sake of completeness, you can see the difference. Again, big, substantial improvements in the very broadest effectiveness story it's got. So across the board, it's a pretty strong scorecard. As I always say at this point in the presentation, nobody buys media in isolation. So it would be wrong to just look at news brands as we have done in isolation. Let's look at it, how it performs alongside other media. And as before, we're going to look at it alongside TV. We're going to look at it alongside social. That's video and non-video social. We're going to pull out the world of online video, which is social and non-social video. We could look at all these in isolation, but you know, it's too early in the day to do that. And then online display, by which I mean all non-video online advertising. Okay, so it's a big basket of stuff that obviously will include a fair amount of news brands as well. And we're going to look at time trends across that period. So let's look at how it has changed. In the past, I've only ever reported the static position over the whole study period, but I thought it would be interesting for the first time just to look at the trend in here. So let's look at how news brands perform alongside TV. So we're looking again at the boost effect it gives to the effectiveness of each of these medium. Now TV we know remains a very powerful effectiveness medium, but look at how we boost it, how that has grown over that period. We had a modest effect on the effectiveness of TV back before the watershed period of the fake news era. It has since dramatically increased. And this begs an explanation, which is coming. Social, well, what can I say about social? It was never a brilliantly effective long-term medium. You all know the story behind that. So we've always had extraordinarily powerful boosts on social, which struggles to build brands. News brands has been a very good brand building medium, so it's always had a natural affinity alongside social. Arguably it couldn't grow much more, but it has actually strengthened slightly in terms of this profit metric that we're looking at here. All online video, similar big explosions, so that's social and non-social, so you'd expect that to be quite powerful. But again, the real point all this data is making is that there was this quantum leap suddenly. Up to 2016, it was relatively modest. After 2016, it just went ballistic. And we see the same with non-video. Quite extraordinary difference. So let's look here at the broader effectiveness metric that we can. So we were looking at profit just then. Let's now look at our basket of business metrics, all 6 of them. So slightly different picture here. TV, we have more modest effects here because we're looking across a broad range of effectiveness. So TV, we have boosted again from what it was before, the multiplier effects that we enjoy when you buy news brands alongside TV. It was strong, it's now even stronger. Social is the interesting one, and I can't absolutely explain why it should have fallen away. I put this down to all the work that was going on, and of course this is pre-Twitter meltdown. All the effort that social was doing to try and improve their long-term act, and they've been doing a lot to try and improve Facebook platforms, particularly their ability to build brands. And then maybe they were having, if you listen to Dr. Karen Nelson-Field, you will know that they have done a fair amount to improve that. So our stellar contribution to the broad effectiveness of what is otherwise be a very weak story for Facebook has actually moderated slightly, but we're still a really important co-buy if you're buying social. Online video, pretty much the same as TV, same picture. What was already strong, slightly strengthened, and online non-video, an even bigger effect. We're an important brand building act to add alongside that. All of that, if I was a skeptic, and I'm sure there are plenty of them out there, I would say, hang on, these numbers are just unreal. And I've deliberately given you the pre-half to the post-half, because the pre-half was a much more credible uplift, wasn't it? 30%, I could buy that. You know, you often get multipliers when you add media. But 100%, Peter, you are joking. How could any extra media buy result in that kind of level of effectiveness? And I get that. And the only explanation I can offer you is two particular brand metrics, because these are the only two metrics that I can look at in the IPA database that exploded at about this time. And that's why I come back to this and why we are part of the trust story here. And the interesting thing is that I'll show you why these metrics are important in a moment, but brand quality has always been an important metric because it drives margin. If I respect and value that brand, I'll pay more for it. And that's gold dust. You know, it's why Apple is the most profitable brand in its sectors in the world, despite the fact that competitors sell a whole lot more volume. It's gold dust to do that. But trust has not always been that case. But now trust and quality are very, very correlated. Just before this meeting, I had a look at the correlation, and it has doubled over the last 20 years. Trust used to not be very strongly correlated with quality. It is now very strongly correlated with quality. Now that tells us something very interesting. People used to assess the quality of brands without worrying about how much they trusted, because they trusted all brands. 20 years ago, trust wasn't a big issue. I will form my views about the quality of a brand based on other stuff. You know, whether I like them, whether my friends are telling me it's good. Now trust has reared its head very strongly, and it is very strongly correlated in a way that it never used to be. And that's the only way I can explain the Newsbrand story. It's the only way I can explain the data that you're about to see. This is the profit, the relationship with profit. So we have 7 brand metrics in the database, and I'm going to look at, just to make it simple, I'm ranking them in terms of their link to profit, the chances that you will drive big profit metrics if you see big shifts in each of these. So we're going to look at the first 10-year period of this millennium with the second 10-year period of this millennium, because we're looking at all the data in the database here. So this is trust and quality. So trust, as I said, was always important. It used to be the number 2 metric for driving profit growth. It is now very strong. It has for a number of years now been the number 1 metric. So if there's one brand metric you should all try and drive for your clients, it is quality perceptions. But one of the increasingly important ways of doing that is going to be building trust in the brand. So this is what's happened to trust as an importance metric. It used to be the least important. Les and I used to laugh about trust when we first, we're so ignorant. But actually it has relentlessly crept up the rankings. It's now the number 2, and as I say, correlated with quality. If we look at broad measures of effectiveness, very similar story. So trust went from number 3 to number 1. Quality went from 3 to number 1. Trust went from 6 to number 3. So all of these business drivers have particularly strengthened for trust, and of course other metrics have fallen down the list to allow that to happen. So big change. I mean, this is an astonishing change, which I missed for many years. It's only because I had to sit down and crunch the data for Newsbrands 2 years ago that I even spotted this. I mean, it's very easy to miss this. And I promise you, it opened my eyes to the whole issue of trust. And I hope it will open your eyes if they haven't already. So it's worth just quickly, if I've got time, just very quickly to look at how trust and profit have grown together over the years. So this is a timeline going back, these are 6-year periods, so we're basically looking at 20 years of data here. So this is the percentage of cases that made big impacts on the trust of the brands they were advertising and their chance of also, therefore, driving big profit effects. And you can see what's been going on. So there was a big spike after the global financial crisis when a lot of financial services brands lent into brand trust very heavily, and by God did they need to. That kind of worked its way through the data, but then you can see in the last 2 years a real strengthening of that. And I would say that despite what we saw about the COVID response, there is no evidence in the data that trust became any less important during the COVID period. I would argue it probably became more important, though I don't really have the volume of data to prove that to you. There's no reason why it should become less important. And indeed, the more people trade online, I would argue, the more trust is an issue. looking for other smoking guns, I thought it would be interesting just quickly to look at media choices, because there is a suggestion in here. It's not proof positive. There is a suggestion in here that certain media choices don't help us. So this is a very simple analysis. What we're going to do is we're going to compare the proportion of budget that was placed in each of these different media, these media channels, by those case studies that did create strong trust effects versus those that didn't. And given that the budget levels and most other variables are very similar across those two groups, I'm going to suggest to you that we might infer that some media choices help us build trust and some media choices hinder us to build trust. It's a suggestion, it's not proof positive, but it's a very interesting and consistent one. So let's just start the obvious one. TV. We know TV is a trusted medium as seen on TV. Everyone still uses that. So you can see here that case studies that did create trust effects, strong trust effects, by and large put more of their budget into TV than those that didn't, and that's exactly what you would expect. It's not a vast difference, but it's a meaningful difference. Then there's a whole bunch of channels, social, particularly social video, where exactly the reverse is true. The case studies that successfully built trust, relatively speaking, put their money elsewhere, into other media choices, like news brands, that help to build trust. It's not to say they completely disinvested, and I'm not suggesting that that's what you should do. But if you're trying to build trust, social video is not an obvious home for your money. There are other reasons to use it, but this ain't one of them. But this is not a go at digital, because search and online display also, alongside TV and press, also seem to be pro-trust. So it's about the environment that you find and the abilities of the media you have. So let's look at some time trends for our impact on brand trust over time. So again, we're going to see how this strengthens. So this is all UK cases. This is just the COVID period we're looking at now, and I can't look at non-advertisers in news brands because we just don't have enough data to do that, but we can look at multi-platform news brand advertisers, which are my best practice. So this was the 2020 picture where we saw news brands users had a much bigger impact on brand trust than all UK cases, and we were indeed, news brand users were the driving force in those trust effects we know in that period. This is what happened in 2022. The COVID panic set in. Everyone pulled out of trying to build trust. There was a massive decline in trust effects in the UK cases as general, but look how news brands advertisers, multi-platform news brands advertisers bucked that trend and held a perfectly respectable position. So if you were faced with a client who was panicking, probably one of the smarter things you could have done in 21-22 or 2021 and 22 is to have at least kept some money in news brands, because at least you could have offset the terrible effects that all those panic strategies out there led to. I mean, this is the uplift. I know it's a convenient way of looking at the numbers because they were falling for non-news brands users, but our uplift more or less trebled. So it was a really important defensive play in terms of brand trust. If we look at time trends over the none versus one versus two platforms, you see again, back in the pre-fake news era, there wasn't that much to report in terms of very large trust effects amongst any of these groups. It hadn't become a big issue, and we weren't a stellar platform at that time. But that's what's happened since. But again, just notice the big wins come from the multi-platform users, not the digital only. If you really want to drive trust, you need to be in print editions as well. And if we look at quality perceptions, you see again a very similar picture that yes, there were healthy uplifts for news brands users in the early part of this period, but particularly for multi-brand users, they've just exploded in the last 3 periods of this data, when, if you like, we're in the fake news era. So look, that's plenty of time. I should have stopped 5 minutes ago. So I'm just going to wrap very quickly. So what you've seen here is that the case for news brands, which has been strong forever, continues to strengthen in the current business environment, in fact, despite the current business environment. And that's really driven by a number of factors. We're seeing that business effects continue to strengthen, so the business benefits we get from buying news brands are stronger than they used to be, and they were already strong, but also because these cross-media synergies, the extent to which news brands can make up for the weaknesses and inadequacies of some other media choices, has strengthened over that time. And that is because, and I promise you this is the only way I can explain it, is because the two drivers of the amazing business performance are real strengths of news brands. It is the ability to drive trust, and through the correlation of trust with quality, the ability to build trust. And this bodes, of course, immensely well for the future of news brands, as the research that Andy and Ian are about to take you through will demonstrate. So I'm going to hand over to Andy on that note.